let's get to wrapping up the course here. So I want to finish up, I'm going to sort of fly through this information here, finish up the information that I was talking about last lecture so I can focus more on the legacy of the dinosaurs. So last time I was beginning to talk a bit about the commercial trade in fossils, and dinosaur fossils in particular, and some of the pros and cons that people have put forward as arguments for it. I have to point out that my particular taxon of research, Tyrannosaurus rex, is featured more in legal haranguing and commercial exploitation than any other dinosaur species, simply because it is the coolest, and that is the reason. Also, it happens to be one that a substantial fraction of the specimens are on land which is privately owned, and therefore, at least in the U.S., there is a legal market in. And these are sort of three classic specimens that have been through some bits and pieces of legal haranguing. Sue, the most complete of these, and one that went through some classic court cases, a Stan on the far end and the dueling dinos specimen in the middle. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I would have if I had more time on these. I just want to briefly talk about, in the case of Sue, discovered in the early 1990s by this woman, Sue Hendrickson, who is working with a team from a commercial fossil hunting group called the Black Hills Institute, run by Pete Larson there. Now, that's a group that actually has worked with research scientists on plenty of times, and they maintain their own museum and so forth. It turned out when they started to excavate the specimen that this was the largest specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex ever found up to that point. It was the most complete specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex found up to that point. So that was very cool. But it also turned out that the land they were getting it from was not what was private land, but they failed to get a proper written contract with the landowner before excavating. So they had paid the landowner $5,000, and then it turned into a big court case that actually involved the federal government coming in and seizing the specimen in an amazing example of sort of bad optics. You know, when you go to a small town, or relatively small town in South Dakota, and go in with the National Guard to take stuff from a local institution, you're not going to generate a lot of good feelings. But what happened was the landowner said that the $5,000 was to prospect, not to collect a specimen. And the Black Hills Institute said, no, the $5,000 was to prospect and collect the specimen. And there wound up being a court case over that. It actually, because the landowner was American, was a member of a Native American population, there are legal rules concerning taking property from their land, so that also got involved there. It was eventually decided that because there was no written contract to show otherwise, that it was indeed the landowner, Maurice Williams, was the proper owner of the specimen, and he was due a fair price for it. But of course, what is the fair price for the largest, most complete specimen of the most famous fossil species? And in our system, there's only one way you can figure that out, and that's find out what the market would bear. So it went on the auction block. After it went on the auction block at Sotheby's, I actually was headhunted as an expert by a museum to evaluate it. Many of us actually were brought in to evaluate the specimen while it's in the collections at Sotheby's, just to verify that it was everything they said it was, and it was. And it was eventually acquired by the Field Museum of Natural History, which is the museum in Chicago. But that museum would never have been able to pay for it themselves. It was actually paid for by a couple of boutique private, little, privately owned institutions. I don't know if you've heard of them, Disney and McDonald's. So yeah, it was money from Disney and McDonald's that was able to pay for this, which at the time was the most ever paid for a fossil, $8 million and change. And it's been researched on plenty of times, and it's on display. Actually, this is the old mount It just recently got a new mount. There's the new mount while it was in progress. Okay, but one of the things that the sale of Sue wound up doing was really creating in the public eye the idea of a marketplace for fossils of any size, and that landowners could make literal millions if they sold off their fossils. And so that's exasperated that situation that I mentioned before. When you commodify something, then it creates an incentive for them not to work with researchers and instead try to commercially exploit that resource. And there are many ranches and so forth that scientists are not welcome on because they want to collect and sell fossils. There was a while there in the late 90s and early 2000s when on sort of a middle class level, the sale of fossils was pretty common. That's back when there used to be like the Discovery Channel store in shopping malls. Back when we had shopping malls, there used to be a primary feature of those, and you could go in there and find fossil fish and so forth on slabs in the back to do things like this with. And in the last few years, this has, in our new Gilded Age, this has really exploded. So I'm just showing a handful of specimens. These are sort of various critters. The Diplodocus, Hypacrosaurus, Triceratops. Here's where a pair of a Diplodocus and an Allosaurus went for $1.6 million each. And it's worth noting, none of these are 100% complete. No, very few fossils are. So many of these have large fractions of them which are filled in, the gaps filled in from other specimens and so forth, and that's what we do normally. This has culminated in sort of the extreme version where Stan, which was another specimen found by the Black Hills Institute, another specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex, wound up being involved in a family dispute as the Larson brothers sort of broke up their partnership and had to deal with their assets. Well, how do you break up a T-Rex? Well, one of the things you could do is sell the specimen and then, redistribute the income. It was actually found back in 87, excavated in 92. It's a relatively complete specimen. It's nowhere near as complete as Sue, but it's relatively complete. And one really amazing thing about it is the skull was disarticulated, and therefore it's a specimen where you can look at every bone from any angle you want, and actually casts of Stan are featured in many museums around the world, both on mounted specimens and in collections. It has been subject to a huge, huge number of research papers, including some of my own. Casts are in dozens of museums around the world, and for a long time, it was the star, it was the centerpiece of the Black Hills Institute's museum in Hill City, South Dakota. But last year, as the result of the court, the decision that they were going to sort of liquidate their assets, it sold, and it blew all of us away. We were expecting, that maybe it would go for around what Sue sold for, and it went for almost $32 million. So vastly more than any fossil has ever went for before. It was sold on October 6th of 2020. As of, I should update this. What is the day? The day is the 13th? I should update this. As of December 13th, 2021, no one knows who the purchaser is. At these auctions, you could do this anonymously. And they have not said what it's doing. This specimen has been lost to science. One of the most complete and important fossils of Tyrannosaurus rex has currently been lost to science. It's been more than a year, and the person hasn't announced themselves. I think if they was going to go to a museum or something, they would have said something. It is lost to science. Now, something that avoided that fate was a young specimen of Tyrannosaurus, or Nanotyrannus, and a ceratopsid, looks like it's Triceratops, found associated post-mortem. It was claimed that they died entwined in combat. There is zero evidence for that yet. But of course, it makes it easier to sell something if you said they're battling in combat rather than reassociated as two corpses in a flood event. And they tried to sell this in the 2000s and 20-teens, but it kept on falling through. This was collected not by the Black Hills Institute, but by people who in general, didn't know as much as what to do, and a lot of the information that groups like the Black Hills Institute would have collected if they were doing it, they didn't. And people are trying to mop up the information, go back to these sites and so forth. So there's the skull of the young tyrannosaur, and there's the skull of the ceratopsid on display there. Now this one was bought. Well, the pair of these specimens were bought for $6 million. And they, however, are going to a public institution, the North Carolina Museum of Natural History, associated with the North Carolina State University. And the way that happened, it's not like the museum the museum or the university had that much money kicking around, but they went to the patrons of the museum who managed to put together this big package of money for an expansion of the museum, and part of that expansion would be an exhibit where they would watch the preparation and study of the specimens as they are worked out. So thankfully this has gotten into a public collection. As has this. This is not just a mandible for $3 million. It was a whole, or pretty much a complete triceratops bought by the Melbourne Museum. This was just last year as well. So, one issue is that sales promote a market. Markets promote the possibility of hoaxes, because people who want to sell something know they can make more money if you sell a complete thing than if you sell a fraction of a thing. And it's very common to have hoaxed specimens of trilobites and mosasaurs and so forth. They're all pretty common. It's actually happened in the dinosaur realm too. There is a huge black market of fossils from China. In fact, there is no such thing as a legal market of fossils from China. Chinese law is that all fossils found within the People's Republic are property of the state. So you can't sell them. Nevertheless, you go to these rock shows around the world, you can find these fossils because there's a black market. And this specimen showed up on at the Tucson Rock Show a couple decades ago, and it was actually featured in a National Geographic article. It was interesting because the front end of this is a relatively derived avialien-like form, but from the pelvis backwards, it looks a lot like a dromaeosaur. And it was featured in this article. And at the opening of, sometimes when there's a big article in National Geographic, they do a big press release and a function where they invite some of the contributors to go downtown in DC and talk about it. And at that time, Steve Zirkus, a dinosaur artist and paleontologist who bought the fossil at Tucson and was trying to talk about it, is here holding it. And Zhu Jing, then a graduate student, now a professor at the Institute for Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing, basically the Chinese equivalent of the Smithsonian. He finally got to see this, and at dinner afterwards, because I actually went out to dinner with him and a few others of the people afterwards, he said, that thing's totally a hoax. Because he was writing up in his dissertation the two different species that were put together here. Indeed, it was the front end of an avialien, and it was the rear end of a dromaeosaur that got stuck together. And in fact, the only scientific paper, because every time people tried to publish the scientific paper on this, naming it as a new taxon, it failed peer review, because people said, this doesn't look like it's one animal. The only scientific paper on it was one demonstrating how the hoax was put together. Well, little slabs were glued together to create a whole animal. So it turns out it's the front end of Yanornis, which is a euornithine bird, and the rear end of Microraptor. Neither of these had been named yet. Zhu Jing was in the midst of describing them at the time. So yeah, and in fact there's a paper that shows how bit by bit these blocks were put together. In some cases, it's got like 2 left feet, or is it 2 right feet? It's the slab and counter slab, they just flipped it over to make it more complete. And then, fill in some gaps to make it look pretty. So yeah, if there hadn't been a market for it, no one would have any reason to put it together like that. Now, in the US, there are certain the regulations with regard to fossils depends on the nature of the land. So generally fossils are regarded as minerals rather than antiquities. So they're not regarded in the same way that human artifacts or human bodies are. And the laws governing them depend on the type of land. A private landowner is the owner of those mineral rights, so they can do whatever they want with those fossils. On the other end, national parks and national monuments are highly protected, and researchers have to go through huge amounts of permits before they can collect things there. And private citizens, it's a crime to take specimens from literally a crime to take specimens from those sorts of lands. In between are other types of public lands that may have various different rules, depending, what sort of federal land, a Bureau of Land Management, or maybe a state park, or a county park or something. They have different rules. And just be careful if you ever go out fossil hunting to know what sort of land you're on and what rules govern them. And just skip ahead here. And so, we have some national monuments like Petrified Forest that is there to protect those resources. And Dinosaur National Monument that exists to protect the resources there. And in fact, there was a fossil-based national monument called Fossil Cycad National Monument in South Dakota. It is I think it's the only national monument that has been decommissioned. And that's because the people who were supposed to protect the park, the rangers, were very lax. And they, even though there were rules of no prospecting, people would just go in there and steal these fossils from that site until there was nothing to protect there anymore, and they shut it down. There's no reason to protect it anymore. It was technically not cycads, but cycadioids. We don't do paleobotany in this class, we don't care. There was a small dinosaur, a hypsilophodontid, which was actually found at that site too. Other countries have different laws. Some nations regard fossils as protected antiquities. And generally around the world, antiquities are more strongly protected than minerals. In some, they are the property of the state or the crown, if you will. For instance, in Canada, or specifically in Alberta, Canada, vertebrate fossils are property of the crown. And that means Queen Elizabeth gets to own them. No, that basically means that they're property of the capital S state. And a private citizen can never own them. Although sometimes you can get certified to keep them in your possession, but you don't own them, even if it was found on your land. So Mongolia, China are that level. Some have no protections whatsoever other than national parks. And a great many have protections that exist only on paper. Or they have a big gray market, which is a black market. The trade is technically illegal, but there's some local government officials that are getting paid off, and therefore it has some bit of protection, even if that protection is via corruption. Now, in all the discussion I had about the fossil hunting and fossil collecting and who's collecting fossils, something that I didn't mention and that I'm bringing up now are the forgotten stakeholders, the landowners, and especially indigenous populations, which, as you know, around the world typically have limited control even over their own land through historic reasons. So, for instance, many fossils that were collected in North America, from the North American West, are on land that even to today is technically the property of indigenous populations, and nevertheless, where they had little say in the collection of that. And that's changing, that people now are much more incorporating local populations in on that. Or during the colonial era, many fossils collected in Africa, Asia, South America, and so forth were done so by the big European powers with little control by the local population. And even to this day, there's a debate as to whether the fossils collected in Tanzania and the Tendaguru Formation, if they should remain in Berlin, or if they should be returned to Tanzania. And indeed, it's more, there are many levels of this. For instance, there are people who argue, even among the Tanzanian scientists, they're saying we don't have the facilities yet to properly care for them. It wouldn't make sense to ship them back here if we can't display them or properly care for them. we should still have a say about their use and their display and in cooperation with Berlin, but not necessarily possession of them in person. And then there's argument in this and some other places. Do they go to the national government? Because the national government of these nations may actually, just like in other parts of the world, may actually not be protecting the rights of the indigenous peoples whose land it was specifically from. So does the Tanzanian government actually represent properly the Lindi people of Tendaguru Hill? That's something that would have to be recognized. That said, there is more awareness now about the reparation of, or repatriation rather, of fossils when they are illegally sold elsewhere. And so there have been a number of cases where, in this case, a Tarbosaurus from Mongolia, you cannot privately own Mongolian specimens, and this one happened to get seized by U.S. customs agencies and was repatriated back to Mongolia. In some cases, rich people who have bought the fossils hear about the fact that it was illegal. They weren't actually aware of it at the time, and some of them are actually moved by the argument to properly send them back, and that's actually a really good thing. That happened in the case of the Dinosaurs specimens. Dinosaurs, this giant ornithomimosaur, long time only known from its arms, but bits and pieces of it were collected by poachers, as well as by an actual Canadian and Korean team working with Mongolians. The private owner who had acquired the poached specimens found out about this from scientists, decided to repatriate it back to Mongolia, and the whole thing has been brought back together. And in some cases, it was poached to the degree where one end of one bone had been collected by the field team and the other one by the poached team, and you could just lock them right back in place. So that was kind of good. So now we know what Dinosaurs looks like. Or these specimens, these eggs that were found of a giant Oviraptorosaur, sold in rock shops, collected by went through a number of different museums in America, featured in National Geographic way back when. Now that includes the holotype specimen of the giant Oviraptorosaur baby lung. There's a reconstruction of the parents and eggs. And it was recognized that it belongs in a museum, and in fact it probably belonged in a museum in China, and that's what happened. And indeed, one of the really nice things here is that those eggs went back to China, but not to Beijing, which was very far distant from where the eggs were. They actually went to a provincial museum in the province from which they came, which is kind of nice, so that the local people can actually see those specimens. They don't have to go all the way to Beijing to see it. So moving forward in terms of working with the existence of fossil collecting, in the US in particular, it's extremely unlikely that laws that make all fossils public property, that's unlikely to pass in North America, well, at least in the US. If anyone who thinks that doesn't know Americans, basically. So there's going to have to be cooperation between scientific and commercial collecting communities. It's an important thing from now on. And even more so, to get outreach to the general public about why fossils are important and not simply trophies. You shouldn't just have them because it looks cool. The importance of fossils is that they are information about the ancient world. And to make certain that all invested parties, landowners as well as collectors, as well as the public, have some say involved. So that's sort of my wrap-up for the issues concerning the commercial collecting, but it segues directly into the final lecture, which I'm going to fly through, but that's okay. And that is going to be the public and dinosaurs, so legacy of the dinosaurs here. So first, how do scientists get their information out to the public? Well, you see one big example of that here. One thing is museums. But it's more than just putting stuff on display. A lot of us have to do, and like to do, public outreach of various sorts. The oldest version is actually to give talks to groups. So here I am standing on a cast of a a baby-long nest, actually. This is in the Maryland Science Center in Baltimore. And talking to a bunch of rich people, that's basically what they are. They're donors to the museum, and every so often a museum, has to make certain that they get the interest in people who can give donations to keep them going, particularly for institutions that have a lot of private support, which is the majority of them. Of course, the main population that we talk to dinosaurs about and with are kids. And people have noticed, for generations now, that kids are just really into dinosaurs. And, people have tried to come up with, as psychologists and education experts have tried to come up with, why is it that kids are so interested in dinosaurs more than, say, some other sorts of organisms or whatever? And some of the arguments that are put forward, and I think that there's a good case for this. One, kids learning about fossils, and particularly about dinosaurs, can get mastery of a subject that their parents don't understand. And it's probably the first time in their life that they, and not their parents, know more about something. And it's comparable to things like, say, Pokemon. Kids get to know many of the different Pokemon and their attributes and something, and their parents don't. And so they go, I can know things that, the big guys don't know, the grown-ups don't know. And, dinosaurs can be mysterious and scary, but unlike, vampires and so forth, and monsters under the bed, they're safe, because they're not here anymore. Whereas, of course, we know the monsters under the bed can still get us. And learning about dinosaurs is pretty useful for kids. So there's one thing, the first thing kids learn how to do is how to characterize or classify. A lot of people in education notice that's one of the first things kids learn about. Categorization, classification. What are the first things that you do? What are the different colors? What are the different shapes, etc.? And that's important developmentally. Also, it's a way to connect with the living world. There's a dead part of the living world, yes, but it's still the living world. And it's a way that kids get to learn about anatomy, and probably the first time they come to grips with extinction, and in some cases, it might be the first time they really come to grips with death. Something we all have to face eventually, and you got to learn about it somewhere, and this is sort of a more pleasant way of dealing with that. So, there have been outreach in terms of dinosaur science since at least the very beginning of Dinosauria. Here's O.C. Marsh. Sir Richard Owen first tied together Hylaeosaurus and Iguanodon and Megalosaurus and gave them the name Dinosauria as the result of his 1841 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And since then, they've been featured in lots of popular science books. This was from a French popular science book showing how big dinosaurs could be. It could be through physical models. So the Crystal Palace models being some of the classic examples of that, still on display even to this day, with their modern cousins swimming around. Of course, the actual skeletons featured in museums. So here are some of the first complete Iguanodon skeletons being ready for display, and then later featured at places like the Smithsonian. So this was the original layout for the Smithsonian's Paleo Halls. As I said, centerpieces of museums. This was a proposed exhibit that was going to be in New York City. Models by the guy who did the Crystal Palace models, but this thing fell through. But later on, real museums actually were built. In this case, this is the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, the American Museum in New York today. So definitely out there. But it's not just the science of dinosaurs that get out there. Dinosaurs have been featured in fiction since the early days. In fact, in the 19th century, there were fossil reptiles featured in fiction, but not so much in the way of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were less well understood. They're featured to a certain degree, but for instance, in Jules Verne's Voyage to the Center of the Earth, or Journey to the Center of the Earth, it's plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs that are seen in a climatic scene in that novel. But you get the dawn of the 20th century and some of the most famous adventure writers of the time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course also more famous for writing Sherlock Holmes. He had a series of adventures of a scientist called Professor Challenger, and the first Professor Challenger story is The Lost World, a story that there's this plateau in Amazonia where because it's been uplifted, prehistoric creatures still dwell there in the modern times. And then Edgar Rice Burroughs, inventor of Tarzan, and John Carter, and some other adventure heroes of the early 20th century, had a whole series, actually 2 different series that featured dinosaurs and other fossil animals. One set inside the world, in a hollow earth, and another in the land that time forgot, as you see here. This is another lost world. This is Arctic continent, isolated from the rest of the world. Dinosaurs made their way into the movies early on. In fact, the third animated cartoon ever made, and the first character specifically invented for animated cartoons, was Gertie the Dinosaur. The previous work by Winsor McCay, the same animator, actually were characters that he had already used in his comic strips, his newspaper comic strips. Gertie was invented for cartoons. And the story of The Lost World was made into a movie, within about a decade or so of the novel coming out. And one of the first cases of stop motion animation. And this is where people would take a model, an articulated model, put it on a diorama, put it in a position, take a picture. Move the models very slightly, take another picture, and so forth. And when you play that back, the animals seem to move. And so here, same guy who did The Lost World, about a decade later, did King Kong, which, if you've never seen the original King Kong movie, is a dinosaur movie. Dinosaurs are strongly featured in it. In fact, specifically, dinosaurs based on the drawings of Charles R. Knight, one of the great paleo artists of the early 20th century. Of course, there is a big ape in it as well, but, dinosaurs are the more important part. Just kidding. Good old-fashioned animation. If you've ever seen the original Fantasia, the 1940 Fantasia by Disney, it's a series of vignettes set to classical music with a different team of animators for each one. And when they do The Rite of Spring, it's actually about the history of the world. And basically it runs from the formation of the Earth through the origins of life with the world's cutest euglena, through the origin of animals. But the main part of that sequence is in a sort of blended together Mesozoic plus late Permian, so an age of dinosaurs plus some other creatures, where scientists from the American Museum of Natural History helped out with them. And it's, so Disney animators at the time working on this. It features, most famously, the battle between a Tyrannosaurus and a Stegosaurus, which, yes, were more separated in time than the Tyrannosaurus is from us, but hey. And it ends with the extinction of the dinosaurs, which is shown as a consequence of massive uplifts and climate change, which is one of the models that was supported by the folks at the American Museum at the time. You get into the 50s, we start to get stop-motion animators and other types of animators bringing dinosaurs or dinosaur-like creatures back, but now the idea isn't necessarily a lost world, but rather that nuclear power and nuclear testing were raising creatures up from long slumber. So one of the most famous of these early on, the beast from 20,000 fathoms. It's supposed to be a dinosaur called Rhedosaurus. It looks a lot more like an overly giant Rawasuchian, Pseudasuchian, but hey. Most famous of the giant atomic monsters, though, of course, Godzilla. Started in '54, and they're still making Godzilla movies even today. Little parts of this were done with stop-motion animation, but the vast majority of it is either puppets or a guy in a big rubber suit. In the 50s, another way of trying to show prehistoric creatures was to take modern animals and gluing rubber falsies on them, horns and frills and spikes, and filming them and then superimposing the humans onto the thing. So these, a maybe almost kind of sort of pseudo-passable Dimetrodon there. Well, at least it's got a frill. But yeah, that's supposed to be Tyrannosaurus Rex up here. Yeah, okay. And then we get to the 90s, and a huge breakthrough in terms of the public perception of dinosaurs. And that is the novel and eventually film franchise of Jurassic Park, where Michael Crichton, the author, and Steven Spielberg, the movie maker, decided to bring the dinosaurs of the dinosaur renaissance to life, in a sense. And so, what horrors are unleashed from Jurassic Park. And through a combination of physical models and the then new techniques of computer graphics, interacting with real sets, produced what remains. The first movie stands on its own. It is still an excellent film, and in terms of being, a summer blockbuster, and knowing is a showcasing Spielberg's talent as a movie maker. He knew the limitations of the special effects and used them well. So there isn't a tremendous amount of footage of the dinosaurs. There's plenty of it, but not a tremendous amount. But what there is done really well. By the end of the 90s, the documentary makers said, we can do this too. And so the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, put together what was at the time the most expensive documentary series ever made, Walking with Dinosaurs. They got a bunch of consultants to work on it, including myself. And they tried to make basically a David Attenborough-like special, but set in the Mesozoic. And this presented sort of a new level of science communication. Not everything in there is great, not everything has stood the test of time, but it was still a wonderful experience and a hugely influential one. In fact, there are a whole bunch of documentaries in the 2000s, the early 2000s, that were used the same basic technique. Of course, they tend, because they're trying to get eyes on TVs, they want to make sure everything dramatic and so forth. So all the predators are always screaming, and their mouths are always open, and so yeah. But there's even another level of communication with science and the public. The connection with the news media. How do we get our ideas out about science, about dinosaurs, or any field? Now, one difficulty is that many news outlets lack subject experts. They don't necessarily have science writers. Some do. Some do have science writers, but many don't. And that can be a problem. Imagine if all the sports reporting was being done by people who don't know the sport. Well, that's what happens in a lot of science news reporting. Also, there's a tendency to want to tell both sides of the story, which sometimes, is certainly valid. But, there was a long time, well after the origin of dinosaurian origin of birds had been well established, that they would always go to the 2 or 3 grumpy people who didn't like that, and it sounded like it was equally weighted, when in fact there's this vast story of evidence, and then a couple of grumpy people who didn't like it. And we know that many news outlets have relevant ideological biases, not so much with regard to, say, dinosaurs, but in some cases with regard to other fields like global warming and so forth. There have been. One big problem with the general aspect of news reporting is news reports, by their very definition, have to be exceedingly brief. But science, by definition, is about the details. And so what you get presented is often a really condensed, sometimes to the point where the real science is missing, version of it. And people often complain about the headlines of, a news item. It's very clickbaity and so forth. Don't blame the reporters. The reporters do not create the headlines. They write the articles, and then some editor comes along and creates the headlines. You can complain about the headlines, just don't blame the reporters for it. So yes, and indeed, they try to make it about as absolute as possible, yes.
So to go off the last point about the headlines, I remember I saw this article about this headline was like, this T-Rex relative found in such and such place.
We'll get to T-Rex as the measure of all things momentarily.
Got it.
Yeah. So some common problems we wind up with sensationalism. People aren't going to read it without looking at superlatives. Often a lack of fact-checking by the media. Sometimes they'll report the same story again and again every year. I'll fly through this right now. Old ideas get perpetuated long after the refutation, like missing link still gets used, even though it's a scientifically nonsensical thing. And towards his point, there are a limited number of popular referents. And for instance, the only fossil species most people know is Tyrannosaurus rex. So everything gets compared to Tyrannosaurus rex. It is the measure of all things. A new mosasaur found, it's the T-Rex of the ocean. A new Cambrian, early Paleozoic arthropod found, the T-Rex of the Cambrian. I still want sometime there to be an article, T-Rex. The Tyrannosaurus rex is the T-Rex of the Tyrannosauridae. So, instance, when Bestachia an early Tyrannosaurid, or Tyrannosauroid, was discovered, they wanted to do news reports on it, and so when it wound up, they had more teeth than T-Rex. Well, all theropods, except for the toothless ones, have more teeth than T-Rex. T-Rex's significance isn't that it has more teeth, it has bigger teeth. In fact, its teeth have such positive allometry, they crowd out the more teeth that earlier forms had. So, yeah. Or, a dinosaur fart article. Someone who calculated dinosaurs, may have been responsible for lots of methane, and here's a calculation. And then they said, well, maybe that would cause the end of the age of dinosaurs. They're just pointing out sauropoda evolves here in the Triassic, and the extinction is over 100 million years later. So, okay. So that said, new stuff is being found all the time. When I showed you this figure before, in the second or third lecture, only the names in black had been named. So over the course of this semester, all those names in red have been published. So there's about 42 new species of dinosaurs named in 2021. Mesozoic dinosaurs, this is. So I include Mesozoic birds, but I exclude Cenozoic birds. And just to show you some that have been discovered that I didn't talk about yet in class, but I will next year. A new Noasaurid, just to remind you, the Noasaurids were one of the sorts of ceratosaurs. They're the smaller body gracile ones. There's some that look like ornithomimid mimics, and some that have forward-pointing fangs. Well, here's a new one that's an Oviraptorosaur mimic. It's got a skull very much like an Oviraptorosaur, but its postcrania shows it's a Noasaurid. And here's a restoration of it, with those dinky little ceratosaur arms. A brand new type of ankylosaur. An early branch, branched off before most of the ankylosaur radiation happened, but occurs late in ankylosaur history, known from relatively complete material. I mean, this is the most complete armored dinosaur skeleton from South America. This is from down in Chile, from back the southernmost part of Chile. And its tail structure is an entirely new sort of tail weapon. It's not the club tail of ankylosaurines, nor is it a thagomizer like a stegosaur. It's a series of very flat osteoderms off on the side. And its closest relatives are all from the southernmost parts of Gondwana, so Antarctica and Australia. So there may be some regional part to this group. Just a couple days ago, a new set of tracks from Spain, from the early Cretaceous of Spain, show a rather fast-running theropod. The one you can see in red is one trackway, and calculated to be over here in terms of the range of speeds. And these are the top dinosaur speeds by trackways from previous studies. They're all theropods. And just a point there, that's Usain Bolt's very top speed. So we've got some of these guys who in a muddy surface are running faster than Usain Bolt, which is pretty fast. I think it's worth noting that the creature involved is likely a subadult Carcharodontosaurid. And as we saw before, the Carcharodontosaurs were not really speed specialists, that the speed specialists are various Coelurosaurs that occur later on. So a good question is, how much faster would young Tyrannosaurs or ornithomimids have been? We still don't know. We don't have good track running sequences from all those guys. So to wrap things up, what things can dinosaurs teach us? Well, they are a good example of teaching people the reality of evolution in very much a safe way. Some people still get wigged out for reasons I don't personally understand. They still get wigged out when they think about the origins of humans. Cool to know where we came from, but when you could see the evolution as shown in the history of dinosaur groups, it's a lot safer. It helps us understand the great diversity of life, both today and in the past. Life can be very, very, very wonderful. It is through dinosaurs that the public is most aware of the existence of mass extinction. And I want to point out that actually the work done on the KPG impactor and the intensity of that blast and its effect on the planet has sparked both investigation of the mapping of Earth-crossing asteroids and the possibility of redirecting them. In fact, it's a probe launched earlier this year to test what it takes to redirect an asteroid, and led into insights of the true damage and intensity of nuclear war. The models used to calculate how dark and cold the planet got were then used to see what would happen if even a limited nuclear war were to occur. And it found you would find devastation in what's called nuclear winter. I'm just going to pass past this because we don't have time to go into it in detail. So it wouldn't be anywhere near as bad as the Chicxulub event, but it would still suck. So yeah, please, no nuclear wars. All right, so yes, dinosaurs are things that intrigue all of us, some of us more than others. So here, when I was about 5 years old, I did this. I still have this. For some of us, it's important. The research is important, although, Dr. Turano stewed in the realization he would win no accolades for finding the world's most medium-sized dinosaur. Why do we do this? Well, obviously, we've got the fabulous babes. So that's my wife. And a skull of Carcharodontosaurus. That was a cast of a skull of Carcharodontosaurus in our friend, an artist's studio. No, it's, well, okay, in part. But to help people learn about the ancient world and the wonderful creatures that inhabit it and their descendants today. So with that, happy holidays for everyone. And hope you are ready for your final exam. And thank you for being a part of this class. And email me with questions if you have. Take care.